Hello and a very warm welcome everyone to yet another session at the Creative Bureaucracy Festival. My name is Bennett Bart and it's my pleasure to be moderating you through this session today. It is one of the BMW Foundation's RISE program sessions at this conference, and it's about designing for a sustainable Planet B. My personal opinion is Planet B is way out in the future, and this is something that we shouldn't focus on too much. That is my very own opinion. Yet, I think there is challenges in our economic systems that are deeply ingrained in the way we work, live, interact in cities, and really pressing problems that we need to wrap our heads around. For this panel today, I'm incredibly happy to welcome three amazing panelists for the discussion, and we'll hear at the end of the panel yet another input by a fourth speaker to this panel. And it is my pleasure to really welcome Eva Gladek to this panel, who's the founder and CEO of Metabolic, based in Amsterdam. We also have Alison Dring on board, who's with the startup Made of Air out of Berlin. And we also have Luciana Neri, who's head of the Resilience Office at the City of Rio. A very warm welcome to the three of you to this session on designing for a sustainable Planet B. Now, I mentioned it in the beginning, Alison, and that is the first question that I want to shoot your way. I mentioned at the beginning that Planet B really feels, for me at least, being an optimist, really far out there. And I wonder what's your take on it? Are we about to discuss Planet B, or is it still Planet A?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I share your optimism about Planet A. I'm pretty attached to Planet A. I think, I think like with the work that we're doing at Made of Air, we're very much committed to Planet A. So the work we're doing really has to do with reversing climate change. And I think we wouldn't do it without a belief that we can have impact. I think that's our kind of goal for as an organization and as people, we take that on. I think the particular lens when we talk about kind of keeping the framework within Planet A is that we have to realize that the framework is a finite system. And I think that thinking hasn't been embraced enough. I think when we talk about finite resources, a system that needs balance, kind of what we can do to problem solve or to correct and counteract. I think these are all kind of accepting theoretically the idea that it's a finite system, but I don't think we really accept it deep down. And I think you can see that in our infrastructure, as you mentioned, in our economic behavior. We're not seeing that kind of adoption happen at a root level where we're completely woken up to the idea that that's it. Once these things run out, that's it. There's no magic technology that's going to come back and add more to that system. And in a way, I don't know if it sounds a little dark, but I find that comforting too. Like I actually like to think that, okay, we have all the tools we need. We were able as a human civilization to do this kind of massive, terrible thing to our planet. We might have it in ourselves to turn it around.
I love that perspective. And I mean, your day-to-day is really about trying to turn this around, right? Do you want to talk about what Made of Air is doing?
Sure. Yeah, our purpose is to reverse climate change, and we're doing that through materials. So we've developed a thermoplastic material that stores carbon from the atmosphere. And this is a carbon negative material, which means that by the time you're making products out of it, forming it like you would a plastic into products in the built environment, in mobility and consumer goods, by the time you have those products, they have a net negative CO2 footprint, which means they're taking CO2 from the air and storing it in products. And the way we think about it is if we can systemically replace our resources, which right now depend on fossil resources, if we can swap those out with resources like our oversupply of CO2 in the air, we can start to see our production patterns, our manufacturing, our kind of growth model that we've supported for so long. We can see that actually have impact in a different way. Instead of producing emissions, it can actually drive demand for emissions out of the air and into products. And that's something that we take very seriously every day.
It's amazing. Thank you. Eva, your job revolves really around the idea of having systemic impact and changing systems towards more sustainability. How do you see, for example, approaches like Allison's and Made of Air fit into the systems that we need to change?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Bennett. Before I answer that, though, I'm kind of curious when you say that you don't think we're in need of a planet B, is that because you think we're doing really well, or is it because you just have a lot of faith that technologies like Allison's will come and save the day? What's the kind of positioning there that you have?
Yeah, I love your question. It is really from the bottom of my heart a belief in our ability, our collective ability to change things for the better. And I do agree with you, Alison, that we haven't awakened yet to the fact that things don't look so well looking forward. But I do believe that there is going to be a massive turning point where sustainability will be the more logical, the more comfortable, the more affordable choice at some point. And I think that's when the entire system is going to tip and move towards more sustainability. And I do hope that this sort of tipping point will happen in time for some of the irreversible effects that we're looking at right now really will stay contained at a level that is still doable. And that makes sure that my generations after ours to come really is have the opportunity that we had on this planet. So I'm definitely team Planet A for sure, and I do think technology plays a massive role, just as mindset does. So I really think it's about changing our mindsets, changing the leadership that we currently see, embracing that responsibility that comes with leadership as well. So I'm Planet A, definitely.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think we're all here on Team Planet A, and as they say, there is no Planet B, really. So we better figure out how to make Planet A work. But your answer really connects very well to what I was going to say in response to your original question about how technologies like Made of Air could fit into really designing for a sustainable future. So one of the things that I often include in some of my presentations is this image of all of these different exponential curves of resource consumption, depletion of fisheries, all sorts of things that pretty much since the 1950s have been accelerating in this positive feedback loop where that's kind of around the 1950s is when a lot of scientists say we entered the Anthropocene, the era of man, where we've actually started to impact different natural cycles to such an extent as humans that we're really entering a new geological era with different rules. And one of the things about systems dynamics is that when you have a positive feedback loop, so something that results in more of itself, so a very simple example of that is just reproduction. You have a child, the child has two children, all of those children have two children. So then you get this exponential positive feedback loop. And those are actually really difficult to put brakes on. In natural systems, normally these positive feedback loops run until they kind of peter out or hit a wall, and then the entire system collapses. Now, of course, we don't want that to happen with our system because it's our life support system. It's the biosphere that we depend on. And the solutions that we need to find to really bend these exponential curves of resource consumption, of carbon emissions, of ecological destruction are to really find these basically we need to find exponential technologies that can reverse those trends, that are able to generate this kind of positive feedback loop for the sake of solutions rather than the in the direction of the problems. And so a technology like Made of Air that Allison's company is developing could very well be one of those types of exponential solutions. So we need to think of things that, from a systems perspective, we need to identify things that can rapidly address problems in a cost-effective way within the constraints of the current system while not creating new externalities. So while not, solving a problem for carbon while creating a biodiversity problem or creating a problem with water. So we always have to be aware of the fact that it's like we're solving a Rubik's Cube puzzle, where we need to be aware not just of the one square that we're trying to move to a new location, but how all of these things are interacting as an algorithm. So there's a certain formula that we can take to identify these exponential solutions. And I think that that's really where the hope lies for getting to health again for planet A.
And that is also the approach that you take in metabolic, right? So the things that you look at, and I know there's certain focus points of your work, so to say, or certain domains that you focus on, and you always take the very systemic perspective on it, not to solve one thing by making another thing worse, right?
Yeah, precisely. So there's a few different thematic areas that we are focusing on. We have defined 6 main transitions that we're trying to drive forward. One of them is in the design of cities and how they function. Another is in products and services. And then we have ones in areas that are much more esoteric: mindset, the governance system, finance. So altogether, we have defined these 6 transitions. And whenever we're looking at changing a system, we first start with a good understanding of how that system is functioning. What are the incentives? What are the drivers that are keeping certain patterns locked in into what they're doing? Where are the sources of impact? And then we can do a kind of root cause analysis to see, okay, well, what are the underlying whys for the impacts that are being driven, and try to go as deep into the system as possible to identify solutions or interventions, and then make sure that we're not creating externalities through those proposed solutions. So new problems that would not exist if those solutions hadn't been introduced. So that's kind of the approach overall.
And what are your approaches towards building solutions then? Like, what's
You
the
mean
outcome
toward?
of your day-to-day work at Metabolic?
Yeah, so I realize that can sound super abstract, but so for example, we redesign products from the ground up, where we really look at like an entire value chain and think about, okay, well, if you imagine this as a fully regenerative, circular, sustainable product, how would it deliver the service that it delivers now if you reconceptualized it? Or when we're working with cities, for example, we start by understanding the city as an organism. We map the metabolism of a city, understand the resource flows, the people, the skills, we have like defined several layers of information that we collect about cities, and using that blueprint, we're able to develop a transition strategy to move the city from its current state to a vision of a circular, regenerative, sustainable model. And that is deployed on many different levels. So everything from working on building projects to, so we've actually been involved in several building developments, especially here in Amsterdam, where we built one of the first circular economy neighborhood, like living labs neighborhoods here, all the way to things like policies and area development strategies. So the results are very tangible, but across many different scales.
Amazing. Thank you. And I do appreciate how you mentioned those 2 elements of cities and how cities are transitioning massively at the moment, and also politics and working with the authorities. And both of those elements, Luciana, are things that you, in your work, in the things that you put your time to, come across every day pretty much. So your role is heading the resilience work that the city of Rio in Brazil is doing. How exactly do you see those innovations and those massive transitions happening, and what's the outlook for cities?
There is a community level that I must translate both of your works. For example, communicating carbon storage is complicated. But some years ago in the city of Rio, we partnered with an institution, and they made a forum and went eye to eye with the most impoverished communities in the city. And they asked people if they knew what climate change was. And more specifically, do you know that the planet is heating up? Do you know that there is sea level rise? Do you know that there is catastrophic level climate? And to our surprise, and the most important, people absolutely knew. They knew the impacts. They had that in mind, and it was and they did know the link between planetary level climate change and what was happening in their community, like flooding or landslides. That was a big surprise and a major opportunity, right? If people already realize, and they have just to make it tangible in things very concrete like waste management and the water use and the flood water and rainwater reuse. So I'm also, again, for Planet A. This is kind of optimism is very much well placed, because there is a communication that is already reaching many levels of society. And again, we do have the numbers, and that was a major opportunity. And also, for example, we in the city of Rio de Janeiro, we do have 600,000 children in schools. And it's just a matter of improving what they learn about climate change, and that has already made a difference. For perhaps it will pay out 5-10 years from now in concrete habits, everyday relations, and consumer habits. So yes, there is plenty of reasons for optimism.
Good. Also Team Planet A. Let's talk about cities for a moment, because I think the city space in and of itself is such an interesting melting pot of people, of things, and covering so little of the world's surface, yet consuming most of the resources. Actually, most of resource flows going into cities, most of the waste streams obviously out of cities, etc. So it really it's a how do you call it, a melting pot, a boiling plate for all the, it magnifies basically all the challenges that we've been discussing, and thinking about how to solve it must be such a difficult job, and especially for someone like you, Luciane, as head of resilience within a city. How do you even wrap your head around a system that is that complex and that large?
First, more consumption, also cities are the decision makers for whatever reason. So this is also a concentration of creativity, of different multidisciplinary fields of science. So there's this concentration is a major asset, and that cities do have, and that it spreads out to other. So we in Rio de Janeiro are very far geographically from the Amazon. But what happens in the Amazon does have an impact in the city as I open my faucet. So the water that we are consuming in the city of Rio de Janeiro through flying rivers, they do come from the Amazon. And so this kind of systemic, those ties to the city and the major geographical areas is something that, as a public sector person, we must also be able to integrate. And again, the decision makers are in the cities, and let's take advantage of this. And
It definitely. I mean, what you're saying is basically cities are, on the one hand, an area of great challenge, but on the other hand, also an area of great opportunity. And this is really where I think some of the work that Alison, for example, you or Eva, you're doing around cities, and how, for example, Alison, in your case, I remember a discussion we had of how architecture interacts with sort of the environment, and how currently cities don't reflect the reality that is happening on the planet and in the atmosphere in the way they're set up. So I do love to see that sense of opportunity in cities as well. But if perhaps from your experience with working with cities, how do you build the right momentum, and how do you get traction on such a complex system?
Well, we're currently really deeply engaged with around 40 cities, mostly in Europe and North America, and to a lesser extent, a couple in Asia. And I have to say that the approach you take with cities varies very much depending on the region, the culture, what's going on, and the policies in place. I'm on the sustainability board of Amsterdam, and we're also very much engaged in the development of Amsterdam as a city. And here, there's a lot of strong leadership and vision. There's consistently left-wing political parties in power that have been able to form a strong kind of vision and plan with quantified targets for how Amsterdam is going to decarbonize, become fully circular. Last year, during the kind of peak of the first COVID lockdown, the city of Amsterdam announced that they plan on using the donut economic model. I don't know if anyone else here is familiar with it, but it's basically to bring the city's operations within planetary boundaries while providing the social services needed for everyone, that was going to be the motor of the economic recovery post-COVID. So in a city context like that, there's a lot of top-down direction, and then there's a lot of stimulus programs to set up innovation ecosystems or create challenges for people in the citizenry to respond and create solutions. That is probably one of the easiest contexts that you can work in terms of cities, because there's lots of cities around the world that are impoverished, that don't have budgets for this, that don't have consistent politics, that don't have the enabling environment to support this. And even yet, in a city like Amsterdam, where it should be, where it is easy, you still run into a multitude of challenges. First of all, one of the biggest challenges is the profit imperative that is underlying everything in our economy. So everything is still designed to grow. It's very difficult to bring forward businesses that don't have, 3-year ROIs or returns on investment, or tops 5 years or something like that, where actually a lot of these investments require cross value chain collaboration, really building of new infrastructure, and will have payoffs a lot later. So I think that there's a kind of short-termism that's really problematic, that is a barrier for a lot of these transitions. So there's it's a complicated issue. And I also think we're facing a crisis of governance around the world. I don't know if you look at the kind of extremism that's going on, the emergence of populist kind of political models, and the divisions that are occurring between people, because people feel threatened. So they're starting to retreat into certain identities that are pitting families against one another along political lines, but that are taking the shape of discussions about the pandemic or about environmental issues, where they're being politicized unnecessarily. So I think I may have strayed from your initial question a little, but I guess I was trying to illustrate the complexities of really working in the urban context.
Which I think is great, because I think you're getting right to the point. Because something I'm wondering about is, how do you create that conducive environment really for innovation and for those transformations to happen? And I hear both of you, Luciana, saying, for example, building that awareness among citizens to understand what climate change is and where resources come from, etc. But I also hear you, Eva, talking about sort of the rise of the populist movement and the governance crisis across the globe. And I think those topics relate in a way, because if we're not able to communicate consistently and build those alliances and majorities actually behind a sustainability transition, I don't see us getting anywhere soon.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where I think the biggest risk for us is, in terms of succeeding at preserving planet A. And I think we need to actually actively explore new models of governance that engage people, that are inclusive, that fundamentally hear people out and allow them to craft a joint vision of a future. Because ultimately, people are quite straightforward in lots of ways and quite simple. We all want to feel safe, to feel loved and accepted, and to have communities that we're part of. And that's the kind of foundation of any kind of future vision of sustainability that we need to co-create with everyone, including the people who feel like they're excluded or they're at odds with the environmentalists. And I think that kind of unity of a kind of joint narrative, that mindset shift that needs to happen, where people coalesce around a joint vision of a much better future, that's at the foundation of any successful transition. So.
What's your view on this, Alison? Do you feel like with a very compelling story like Made of Air capturing more carbon than it emits basically in its production, is that a narrative that you find resonates with a lot of people, or is it still difficult to get that idea across?
I think it's a really, I think those are really solid points. I would say that in our experience, we're getting the whole ecosystem of mindsets, and it's really fascinating. So when we start to work with a company, and a company has this kind of all the components of a society within it, and we usually start at the point of entry is always a visionary. So it's somebody that already can go with you, is optimistic, is placed in a company where they can pivot and see and be able to distribute innovation where they think it needs to go. And a lot of the companies we're already working with are on track. They have sustainability targets, or they're facing pressure from their governments. So these are companies that are already prone to action. But we have great conversations with the visionaries. We're all aligned. Everybody's happy. It's going to be fine. But then we have to move on to usually what comes next, which is the pragmatist. And this kind of archetype of customer is difficult because they represent a system normal. And what they want to see is step change. They understand that climate change is a problem. They think that companies and society can do something about it. But let's not go too far ahead of ourselves. Let's make sure the economic bottom line stays. Let's make sure that we're still participating in what are the hallmarks of a fossil economy and not jumping into what should be a future economy around climate change reversal. So this is, we got to deal with those as well. And finally, we have skeptics all the time. So we have people that are flat out saying, I don't believe you. They can even accept that climate change is real, of course. They're not always dealing with people that are denying it, but I think it's like to get them to adopt, it takes a lot. It takes a lot of economic incentive, which I believe that for me, government, and I totally agree, we're having a governance crisis right now. We're seeing governments not providing incentive or penalizing, which is a kind of incentive in its own, for acting. And I think where we sit is we're working all the way down a supply chain. We're working with people that can see the whole overview, and we're working with people on the ground that just have businesses in manufacturing, for example, that need to survive. They need to understand where their next paycheck is coming from. And we realize that you have to make economic winners of people that don't have the belief system in place. And I think that's where, with our company day to day, we're kind of seeing that whole thing revolve all the time. And it's fascinating and and overwhelming. And I'm not sure sometimes who we're convincing and if we're going to get anywhere with it. But I can recognize that there are many, many characters, and it's going to take a lot of diversity of conversation to be able to get somewhere.
I
Bennett, can I ask?
Yeah, go ahead, Eva. Sorry.
Well, if you have something lined up, then you should go ahead. But I guess like one of the things that I've been wondering on the backs of what you're saying, Alison, and what I was saying just before, I'm curious for actually both of you, Luciana and Alison, what are the kind of main challenges that you're facing right now in terms of getting to scale your solution, your company, but also to achieving what you're trying to achieve in terms of resilience in Rio. Because if it's not awareness, then what is it? And I'm also just wondering if it's also like a financial thing, or is it a mindset thing? Just very curious about this. But Bennett, feel free to take it wherever you want.
I can jump in
You take it
quickly.
away, please.
I can say, I would say like one of the challenges that is changing right now, but is consistent, is this idea of the green premium. And this is really like what is a customer willing to pay to be able to do something about the climate? And this is these technologies are expensive. They're also offering another value. So what we're trying to do in our daily work is deliver a material that can perform like any other material, can do everything an existing material can do, but it reverses climate change. And that's an added value to a lot of the product value chains that we're looking at. When you deal with a system that's reliant on like fossil plastics, for example, which are dead cheap and it's a commodity and it's invisible, so you can leverage as a company anytime you want onto those suppliers. And I think that what happens is there's a price difference. And so what's the incentive for that company to pay it? And I guess we're getting more creative. Like the further we go into this as a society, we're talking about carbon pricing now, and the whole world of carbon accounting will start to incentivize the green premium. But at what point will a company just say, we're going to do it? That it's not going to be
Because
about
it's the right
profit.
thing.
We may not make as much profit. Yeah. But we have to do this to survive. When are we going to realize that our systems are finite?
And I do have something to just came up, Elsa, to build on what you're saying. And public procurement, it's very easy to fall in the trap of buying the cheapest option, the short-termism, right? And if you don't buy the cheapest option, there is a major justifications that you have to do. And of course, we absolutely must respect taxpayers' money and etc. But the short-termism, when you think of what science is already telling you, the local universities, it's a very concrete example. Some years ago, a mayor in Brazil was offering plans to rebuild an informal settlement. So what you call a slum, and urbanization, to urbanize it. But also, science is telling us that this is a flood-prone area. Sea level rise will basically reach that community in the next decades. And so do invest public money for infrastructure if science is already telling us, and the satellites and the NASA is telling us this is a sea level rise prone area. And so again, the cheapest option quite often becomes much more expensive if you don't incorporate climate and systemic thinking. And again, there is just a lot of paperwork that you have to go through to justify, sometimes perhaps almost be an evangelist. Tell all levels that the science and the universities are, and deal with all kinds of denialism. Because there is denialism 1.2, 1.0, 1.3, 3.4, and the blind spots that even experts fall into the trap. I was in 2015, I remember we were in a meeting with basically the city of Rio invited the creative minds and the heads and the NGOs and to think of a vision for the city of Rio. And it was very much So I was a child in the 1980s, and the vision for the city is absolutely not what the Jetsons would, the cartoon, the Jetsons, those spikes and grays and basically what people want is very simple. They want to see trees and they want to hear the birds and they want a safe commute and they want drink water. Uh, in the city of Rio, we still have a major sanitation problem, which so the room for experimentation and sometimes it gets very complicated to innovate. That is not to say that we cannot learn from other cities, that we cannot ask, that we cannot welcome companies that are dealing with carbon storage or rethinking design cities. And but again, it's just that our window of opportunity is shorter and shorter. The time for action actually is perhaps we are behind already, but optimism is also is what makes us get up in the morning and is what will take us for a vision that includes it's more inclusive, resilient, equitable, and actually improves livelihoods.
And there is that sense of urgency. I fully agree. That's why I want to shift gears, perhaps to focus not on the challenges, but let's have a look at what are the solutions. Like all of you mentioned basically that element of a visionary, basically coming in with a different mindset, breaking up those used old patterns. And this is the Creative Bureaucracy Festival, and bureaucracy doesn't have the most fun ring to it, I guess. We all have our pictures coming up in our heads of piles of paper. And I wondered, let's look at bureaucracy from a very broad perspective, ecosystem-wise. Like, how do we create an ecosystem that is conducive to these kind of innovations? What are the very things that we can do, whether we are in an accelerator program like myself, or a startup, or an investor, or a government? What is the role to play, and how do we install the leadership that we need going forward? Who feels called for the question? Alison, go ahead.
I would just say, I think it's where I sit. It's in a very entrepreneurial context. I think we're not forming policy. We are in commercial space, and we're trying to do what we can in those parameters. Even they're big parameters too. So we're quite privileged to have those levers. I think what we are as entrepreneurs is actually agitators, and that's how I feel most of the conversations that I'm in. We have, like I mentioned, we're dealing with visionaries, pragmatists, and skeptics everywhere that we move, and I think what makes it work is to be able to have a conversation with each one. And I think I've always thought that people act differently than organizations. People independently, things really resonate with them. They understand deep down what the problem is. And I agree with Luciana, like it's sometimes just want to see some trees. They have a very basic human principle behind most of what they do. And I think when they get in organizations, they behave very differently. So when we're in there, I think the way that we're trying to tackle those conversations one-on-one is to understand what makes those people feel safe. And it's a very simple thing, understanding that they have never won for climate change. They've never been an economic winner. They don't understand the pathway to their own survival as a company. So I think there's something about I don't know if it's empathy, but somewhere close to that, trying to understand what are their positions, and be with them and see if we can figure it out together. And then what we're getting is a kind of much more diverse, much more rich solution than what we thought in the beginning. So I think the way we're approaching it is let's just keep evolving it, and let's keep getting close to the pain points within the people and where they sit in those organizations, and just turning the conversation one by one.
Eva, what do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, your question was broader too, right? It was about like what should all of these different actors do in order to get us toward the solutions that we need to see. I actually, one of the things that we've been really looking into is this. Well, there's a couple of things I want to mention. So, one is I think that this governance question, this crisis of governance that we're seeing on a large scale, is also occurring within organizations, and that's also one of the reasons, Allison, that I think people act so differently within organizations than they do on their own. They don't necessarily speak from their own values or what they think is right for the world, or because there's all these infrastructures that keep them in place, the incentives that are there. And one of the things that we're exploring at Metabolic is crafting a new operating system, which is really a self-governance model, not quite holacracy, but a modification of it. And I feel like if we had governance systems in our cities, in our organizations that really tapped into people's individual values and the things that they really care about, and really aligned those with their actions, we would actually start to fix a lot of the basic problems that we're seeing. So, really exploring new governance models in cities as well as organizations. And that's a big can of worms, a big topic to open up and discuss. And another thing that I wanted to mention is this kind of ecosystem approach. So rather than looking at single solutions, like if you're trying to transform, let's say, an entire value chain in the context of a city. Let's say you're trying to eliminate the use of single-use plastics for packaging. You actually need many different actors to coordinate on that. So perhaps you need a company or a set of companies that are producing reusable packaging materials. You need to engage consumers through an advocacy campaign. You need to have space from the city for cleaning facilities. You need to have regulations on making sure that the cleaning of these reusable products is safe, and then electric vehicles to transport all of that. So by taking a kind of portfolio-based approach, an ecosystem-based approach to solving certain challenges, and that relates, to this, like looking at an entire transformation of a value chain, but also really looking at all the different civic actors that need to play a role. So, like you said, Luciana, procurement funding is such a huge stimulus if it's correctly directed. So if you have the right incentives to seed the need for a kind of ecosystem shift in a value chain in a city, and then having the right financing partners who can bring in new blended finance instruments that can mix that public funding with maybe impact bonds and other things that can really reduce the pressure on the returns that you need. And so taking this kind of ecosystem-based approach to transforming our kind of economies, and cities are perfect labs for this. So if you get cities to participate along with financiers, with the public sector, and the civic sector, all the different actors, and you need a kind of party that can bring them together to glue this all together, to create like an ecosystem-based approach. And that's actually something that we've been exploring. We actually have something called the circular innovation ecosystem that resulted from a study where we were looking at, okay, well, why, even though all these cities know that transitioning to a circular economy is a really good idea, many of them have visions and plans around it, but it's still not happening. You could say the same for any environmental objective, decarbonization. And we found that funding was indeed a problem, but it wasn't the only problem. It was the lack of these different instruments, this portfolio and ecosystem-based approach, and different incentives and governance models.
Luciana, looking at the city of Rio, maybe as a last question for this round, do you think you have that cross-sectoral portfolio approach nailed in your city, or what's the thing that you would wish for going forward?
It's being built as we speak. Of course, city departments are very much siloed. Public budgeting is a serious constraint. That is not to say that you cannot make departments collaborate towards common goals. One very tangible example, some years ago, the city of Rio made pretty much a control room people sitting down looking at cameras, which is not, you see, perhaps so 70, so maybe as seeing the city, seeing the and the but the most important thing, it was not that the problem was on the screen at all times, which is also a positive thing, but that people from different departments and fields were sitting side by side, literally every day, going to work. And you are a geologist, a meteorologist, and a biologist, and a traffic person, and just making this physical space, and or is already a solution-based approach, and it already opened fields of opportunity and dialogue and discussion. And I don't want to sound, but eye contact when it comes of public policies, it should begin at the start and at the end. There is eye contact. Of course, I have hard evidence and demographic data and the participation, and you ask people, but at the moment you deliver the public policy, there is eye contact, and there must you must be able to answer the needs, and make the right question and keep asking and keep asking. So
Keeping
of
the
course,
curiosity.
absolutely. So again, collaboration is built every day at each morning, and it's not a given.
It is a great call to action. I think keeping that curiosity and keeping that what I take from your eye contact is keeping that human element in the interaction, understanding that we as humans are not silos. We shouldn't operate in silos, and the more we're able to cross-pollinate our thinking, perhaps the better solutions we're able to come up with in the end. What gives me a lot of comfort in my Team Planet A mission is to see three wonderful women doing a lot of amazing work towards keeping our planet safe and healthy and resilient. I do want to thank you sincerely for doing that work, but also for being here on the panel today. We're on time. Alison, Eva, and Luciana, thanks so much for being here, and have a nice Creative Bureaucracy Festival out there. Thank you.
Thanks, Bennett.
Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I think the conversations that we are about to have been having, are really a critical part and a critical conversation that we need to be having. And I think the analysis of bureaucracy has been under investigated, and I think it requires deep analysis. I want to talk about bureaucracy from a very particular lens today. And the lens I want to bring forth is that I want to talk about an idea that actually we are living in an age of war right now. An age of war which is fundamentally destroying future generations and effectively destroying our ecological systems. That age of war that we're living in needs disarmament. We need to disarm that age. We need to build the frameworks of peace, and we need to build a new model of restoration. Now, I want to put that frame onto our conversation. And then I want to say that our age of war is constructed on a theory of bureaucracy. And our bureaucratic frameworks are the instruments of that war. And it would come as no surprise that most of our instruments of bureaucracy have been constructed through a theory of how kings, queens, emperors, leaders have actually constructed and maintained power over a place and location. So I would argue that actually most of our instruments are the mechanisms of war. Our bureaucratic systems are mechanisms of war, control, enslavement, and servitude. That's an interesting way to begin this conversation for me, because I think what it starts to ask us is, what is the nature of these instruments? Now, I would argue that an employment contract is a contract quasi of servitude. It asks you to relinquish your rights in order to perform an act in return for some resources. It is not an invitation of ennoblement to bring your most human self to the table. It is an act of in service to the macroeconomic or managerial model and procedural model that's defined. I would argue most of our thesis of ownership, whether it's owning a piece of land, gives us the right to destroy the soil. And is that right? So we have an act of enslaving a piece of land to our short-term needs, ignoring the fact that soil is produced and will take 10,000 years or plus to produce and is actually fundamental to future generations. And I've just listed two examples here, and I would say the centralization of money production in itself is a thesis of centralization of perception of value and a perception of what is investable. So, and that's a problem of information. So I would argue that our instruments around us are fundamentally mechanisms of control and fundamentally mechanisms of enslavement. And they are mechanisms of abstraction of value. So the value of a forest can be reduced to the value of timber, as opposed to recognizing the multiplicity of benefits and co-beneficiaries of that forest. So we have created instruments of abstraction, instruments of control, and instruments of actual ownership, which is creating in servitude. And the thesis I want to bring forth is that that period, that idea, those ideas are manifestations of a very particular worldview. Are manifestations of a worldview that's taken the last 400 years or so to build, whether it's a combination of Cartesian logic or Newtonian thinking of object, subject, thermodynamic thinking, which allows us to see the world through the separation of us and them. That separation allows for a theory of violence to be enacted. And we know whether that violence is between us and the land, us and each other, that's a mechanism to hold violence. And I think the proposition I bring to everyone here is that theory was perhaps, and I think it's debatable, I leave this to another room, was perhaps an evolutionarily important thesis in terms of us recognizing ourselves in the world through being able to separate ourselves. But increasingly, and that was a theory relevant to what I would call an infinite world, where we thought the world was infinite and we were making discoveries into the world. And that discovery gave us power. We were the discoverers, rather than recognizing that actually we may have experienced the discovery, but actually other things pre-existed. So this was a mechanism, and kind of the loose term that's used around this is theories of colonization. So the object-subject relationship allowed us to construct these weaponized viewpoints. Now we've moved into a different world, a world of interdependence and entanglement, not just interdependence, but entanglement. And that entanglement is manifested by hyper-objects, or hyper-objects as have been often defined, by things like climate change. Ozone layer was another. These mechanisms, these things that have existed that manifest our entanglement, are supply chains which are globally entangled in terms of rare earths and other things. So this entangled reality is now feedbacking back into us at a rate faster than our idea of being able to isolate objects, which means that the interdependence becomes more valuable than actually the isolated value. And that value and risk is actually opening up different theories of consciousness. So you could argue, for the first time ever, the planet, as a combination of machine intelligence, human intelligence, and ecological capabilities, we're building a new planetary consciousness and planetary awareness. And you could argue our ability to address climate change is the first example of a planetary consciousness. So we're starting to build sovereignties at a scale that we've never understood before, and certainly are able to conceptualize. So we have a conversation of where is sovereignty at the level of the individual or level of the planet. These conversations are starting to become difficult because our concepts of isolation and independence become challenged by interdependence in radical formats. And the reason why I bring this forth is that fundamentally changes our question of our bureaucratic technical landscape. So what is ownership in an entangled world? What are beneficiary relationships? What is work? What is an employment contract in an idea of equals, and actually an idea not constructed on servitude, but ennoblement? What is money production when we don't want it to be centralized money production in the hands of the few, but actually a decentralized agency to organize resources from the future to the present? What is our theory of actually enfranchising democracy, growing the enfranchisement of democracy to include not only present generations, but future generations, and also non-human generations, like a nation of trees, as indigenous leaders would call them? So how do we start to expand all of these frameworks requires new types of institutions, new types of bureaucratic frameworks, and a fundamental re-examination of our idea of what it means to be human. The theory of human economists, which talks about self-orientated greed, or even the manipulation of us using biases and manipulation of us using short-term endorphin releases. These sort of things are actually just manipulations, but they are deeper senses of self that extend beyond that. How do we unlock a kinder sense of human? All of our contracts are designed for the failure of human beings as opposed to the ennoblement of those frameworks. So how do we build actually not extrinsic incentive systems, but actually create the feedback mechanisms for intrinsic motivation and organization? So these are fundamental questions which actually at the heart of which sit the question of how we organize the world and construct the bureaucracy of the 21st century. Now, I think this is a viewpoint that has to span on our thesis of what it means to be human to our thesis of what it means to be part of a planet and interdependent with a planet. And it challenges everything around us. So my proposition to you all is that we are in a moment of radical change which actually transforms our relationship with ourselves, our relationship of how we perceive ourselves, our relationship with others around us, our relationship with each other, our relationship with the future, our relationship with things and places. And our relationship with things has to be expanded to include, one of the things we're looking at is what if everything is a citizen? What if we acknowledge the citizenship of a river, of a forest? We know this is already happening. So in this future, what does it look like? What does this world look like? But more importantly, I think the big question for all of us is what is the future of our bureaucratic infrastructure to unlock these viewpoints? And that, I think, is fundamental, because the tools of violence are our bureaucratic instruments. So if we want to engineer and operate in a new age of peace and disarmament, it is the transformation of our tools of bureaucracy that is critical and fundamental. And that goes all the way from our theory of corporation to our theory of employment contracts, to our theory of ownership, and the theory of capital and value production. That is a critical task. And that, to me, is the reimagination of bureaucracy for the 21st century. With that, I thank you sincerely for your time and the time to be able to contribute. Thank you.